Hi.
Greetings, everyone.
We're in the Pure Worship book under the subtitle, I Will Take Pleasure in You.
What page is that?
This is page 104. So I'm going to only read one paragraph. One of Christ's early actions as king was to join his Father in an inspection of the arrangement for pure worship on the earth. As Jesus had foretold in his illustration of the wheat and the weeds, it had long been impossible to distinguish wheat from weeds, genuine anointed Christians from impostors. Now, though, the harvest season arrived in 1914, and the distinction was clear. For decades leading up to 1914, faithful Bible students had been exposing the gross errors of Christendom and were beginning to separate themselves from that corrupt organization. It was Jehovah's time to restore them fully. So early in 1919, just a few years into the harvest season, God's people were set completely free from captivity in Babylon the Great. The exile was over. So this is getting where they're making a modern day application to the Ezekiel stuff we'd read before.
Yeah. Now, we need to say right away, notice the insistence upon the harvest starting in 1914 here.
It just stated as if that's a fact.
And what were they believing at the time? We'll get to that when we go to the box, which is on page 102 in your official version. That box is pretty big, so we'll only deal with a part of it today. I'm going to be reading it from the screen, if you will excuse my seeming distraction. Why 1919 is the subhead, right, on the box?
I think we should comment on the fact that they call Christendom a corrupt organization as if it's just one big thing out there.
One thing you know for sure if you've been in Christendom, it's not an organization.
Yeah.
It shows how much you're intoxicated by this concept, though, that God must use an organization. You even think of that's what's absent from Christendom. Most of Christendom, anyway, is organization.
Yeah, and I think you should think about when they thought the harvest season began, and when they thought 1914, what they expected for 1914. This is all giving you a different impression than if you were reading the literature from the time.
Yeah, this is a totally misleading impression you're going to get from this. And they started out with a picture of Rutherford speaking to an outdoor crowd. It says a landmark convention in 1919 provided powerful evidence that God's people were finally freed from Babylon the Great. And then the subhead is why 1919? And so here's how they start that. Why do we say that God's people were freed from bondage to Babylon the Great in 1919? A combination of Bible prophecy and the facts of history helps us to arrive at that conclusion. Now, what were those facts?
Okay, the two paragraphs underneath say, Bible prophecy and history show conclusively that Jesus began reigning as king in heaven in 1914, signaling the start of the last days of Satan's system here on earth. What did Jesus do upon becoming king? Did he immediately free his earthly servants from bondage to Babylon the Great? Did he appoint his faithful and discreet slave in 1914 and begin in the great work of the harvest? Evidently not. Remember, the Apostle Peter was inspired to note that judgment would start with the house of God. In a similar vein, the prophet Malachi foretold the time when Jehovah would come to his house of worship, accompanied by the messenger of the covenant, the Son of God. That time would be a period of refinement and testing. Does history harmonize with those prophetic indications?
Well, when they say evidently not to him coming to appoint the faithful and discreet slave in 1914, where they're moving it to 1919. Does that help them at all? Because when you know the history of the organization, you realize that first paragraph is just one misleading statement after another. First of all, when did Christ begin reigning according to the organization at that time?
1978 was what they believed.
1878. He began.
Sorry.
1878.
1878. Yes.
He began reigning in 1878, but he'd been invisibly present since 1874. And that was not signaling the start of the last days. They believed the last days had begun in 1799.
Yeah, so where is those facts of history in here?
The facts of history, yeah. So, and also, what was 1914? It wasn't the beginning of the last days. It was the end of the last days.
Even the thing about did he appoint the faithful and discreet slave? Well, they believed he did. They believed that Russell was the faithful and discreet slave. And they continued to teach that
for 10 more years.
After 1919.
For 8 more years, they continued to teach that. This is all totally devious, as far as I can tell now, because somebody at headquarters knows most of the stuff we just said, but they're not admitting it here.
Yeah.
Now, what does the organization itself say about those confessing their sin? Well, it makes your status with Jehovah, your relationship with Jehovah, depend upon your willingness to confess your sin. This is what elders are told at elder school. As soon as they become elders, they get a book, and that's the chief mark of a repentant person who can continue to be in God's organization as he confesses his sins and leaving it.
So remember, the last question was, does history harmonize with those prophetic indications? And they say it certainly does. So they just ignore what they were teaching at the time. And when you think of what they were teaching, they had a location in the planets for God. They had no objection to war at that time, going to war. There was no neutrality teaching. They weren't emphasizing the name. They were preaching different dates for the beginning of the harvest and for the beginning of the kingdom.
Yeah.
The end days. They were setting all kinds of dates for things to happen. Their expectations for 1914 were that's the end date, not the beginning date.
And the very book that they say Christ was using to evaluate their credentials, the Finished Mystery book, says that the end would come for Christendom in 1918.
Yeah.
And the fire would fall from heaven upon the whole system of things by 1920. When that date goes by, of course, they move the end date to 1925, and that date then goes by. And Russell, in the meantime, has been discarded.
Yeah. But they're practicing all the things they condemn Christendom for. Christmas and birthdays and all of that's still going on. They have no problem with these things. The cross is on the front of their magazine
for years to come. So,
and they believe the Jews had a place in God's plan.
Yeah, so the kingdom is both dated wrong, 1878, and of course it was then revised to be dated wrong again, 1914, and then the Jews being restored. That was what they thought the kingdom would bring about immediately, and of course they don't. That teaching was completely gone by 1931. So, is there anything here that's accurate? We went through every sentence, I think, of the 2 paragraphs.
Yeah, no.
And you have to
It's
have to know
misleading.
somebody is complicit in the writing and in the governing body approving of this stuff. You have to be conscious that you're telling untruth. Let's just call it what it is. It's a fabrication.
Yeah.
You've rewritten your own history.
Some witnesses will say, well, I knew about the birthdays and Christmas and stuff, but this was the refinement period. They'll say that, but
you haven't.
You really don't know what was going on at the time, unless you read those books and the emphasis and the just the dogmatism of those books.
Yeah, you're still holding to the basic beliefs of Russell, even though you've discarded many of the technicalities. He believed that God lived within our time-space continuum. Christendom has never taught that. And because you believe that, of course, you will not have you'll have no ability to see what Christendom sees about the attributes of God, and therefore the Trinity doctrine and lots of other doctrines, predestination. They're all wrapped up with time and space and what you think of them. So
and you
you've got the wrong God, and unfortunately, when you've got the wrong God, the wrong view of man, and the wrong view of God, you have the wrong view of the God-man.
And if he was coming and testing you in 1919, on what basis would he have picked you, given all these facts?
So it becomes what the English call bunkum. Everything here. And that's what's so sad, that you're still clinging to these dates, 1914 and 1919, as if they mean anything at all from the prophetic point of view. What's our link?
We're linking a video called Last Days Began in 1799. Insists Russell and Rutherford. They insisted this.
Yeah, we don't. I think everybody kind of knows by now, if they're ex-witnesses, that Russell taught these things. But did we know that Rutherford insisted they were true even after he dumped Russell? He was still insisting that 1799 was the beginning of the last days. So this video is showing you how much continuity was between Russell's teachings and Rutherford's in the first 2 decades anyway. See you next time.